Welcome to Case in Point, produced by the University of Pennsylvania Law School. I'm your host, Steve Barnes. In this episode, we'll be talking about America's looming retirement crisis and what may be done to address it. We'll be speaking with Deepa Das Acevedo, a Sharswood Fellow here at Penn Law, who'll be offering her insights into analysis about what may be done about this issue. Well, great. Well, let's get started. So, how would you characterize the state of Americans' retirement, readiness, and security?
It's not good. I mean, it hasn't been good for a while. Pension plans were being poorly managed in the 50s and 60s, which is why in '74 Congress enacted ERISA. But since then, I think employers have been decreasing the number of defined benefit or pension plans that they offer, and they've been moving more and more towards defined contribution plans like 401k plans, or just not offering anything at all.
Right. So you mentioned ERISA. What is that?
ERISA is the statute that allows Congress to exercise some oversight over how welfare and health plans are managed. So it doesn't require employers to offer any sort of benefit plans, but if they do and they meet certain other criteria, then they have to manage the plans in a certain way.
Okay, so in your research, some of your latest research, you say that America's retirement crisis isn't just one complex problem, it's two. Could you explain what you mean by that, please?
Right. So if you think about it, there are two things that we need to do in order to have a certain degree of financial security during retirement. One is that we need to have an adequate amount of money available to us, and the other is that we need to manage that money well. So part of the problem is that a lot of Americans, for whatever reason, just aren't saving enough money, so the pot that's available to them upon retirement is inadequate. But the other problem is that managing that money both while you're working and after retirement, when you're trying to decide how much to draw down, what accounts to draw down from, that requires a lot of financial sophistication that a lot of us just don't have.
So your proposed solution to this crisis, at least in part, is something you call shadow 401ks. What is a shadow 401k and how would this all work?
Okay, so a shadow 401k, and I call it a shadow just because it's not meant to offer a one-size-fits-all or a complete silver bullet to the problem of retirement security, and also because it's meant to follow workers along from job to job. So the basic idea is to force wealth accumulation during a person's working life, which can then be used to purchase an annuity upon retirement. And it would be managed by the Social Service Administration, much like Social Security is. But I think a couple of the main differences are that it wouldn't provide for disability and survivor benefits, which Social Security does. It's focused purely on retirement. And secondly, contributions are not being pooled. They're being maintained in an individual account. So it's not a tax. You're only providing money for yourself, your future self.
Right. So just to get into the mechanics of that then, so the SSA would administrate it, and if someone like me had a shadow 401k, some portion or a small percentage of my wages would go into that. Now, would that be like your typical 401k where you've got, a series of stocks or bonds or whatnot that you're invested in, or would it be more governmental? And if so, what are the ramifications of that, given the political debates about the level of intervention the U.S. government has in people's everyday life?
Right. So, I mean, the specific breakup between stocks and bonds or government bonds is something that I think would have to be worked out in the finer details. But one of the things that distinguishes the shadow 401k idea from some of the other proposals that are floating out there, and there are a lot, because I think this is a fairly common problem, and the idea of having a benefit plan that follows workers across their lives is something that a lot of people are coming around to. One of the differences would be that the government doesn't put its full faith and credit behind the plans. And that, on the one hand, makes the shadow 401ks less of a security benefit for workers, but on the other hand, I think it also makes it more palatable and maybe a more realistic option at this point.
Right. So if I go to retire, for example, and pull my money from this or access my money from the shadow 401k, if my plan is underwater given the stock market, that's my own problem, not the U.S. government's. Is that correct?
Fundamentally, right now, unless we're willing to enact governmentally guaranteed benefits, which personally I'm not sure that we are in this political climate, that is something that's true of all options on the table at this point.
Okay, great. So you also say that shadow 401ks are a stepping stone, not a permanent solution. What do you see as a longer-term proposal to address the crisis?
Well, so part of the problem, and this isn't something that shadow 401ks address, is that we don't know exactly why people aren't saving enough. Maybe it's because they find the entire issue of saving for retirement scary. Maybe it's because they find it too confusing. Maybe it's because they have other priorities. Not everyone wants to save for retirement ahead of building a house or providing for sick relatives. Maybe it's just because they don't have enough money to save, and if that's the case, especially the latter, then we need to figure out another way to give people the ability to have enough to save enough, and that is not something that happens in the benefit planning space. That's something that happens when we start talking about income inequality, minimum wage issues, wealth distributions. It's not something that would be solved by a shadow 401k proposal.
Right. So what do you propose then in terms of ways in which, at least in terms of the retirement crisis and promoting retirement security, we as a nation and as a body politic can address things like income inequality and the minimum wage and so forth? Easy question.
That, I think, would take minds far better than mine and a few lifetimes to figure out. I think that there are a lot of things that we could be talking about, and we have been talking about at a legislative level, but it's not really clear where that's going to go in the immediate future. So, minimum wage, raising it has been something that's been on the national mind for a while now. I'm not sure exactly how promising that looks right now. Another option has been, talking about an automatic IRA that's been floating around in Congress for a while, but bipartisan support has been going down for that. So if we want to talk about income inequality and, minimum wage, those are really things that happen in other areas of legislation, and they would require, I think, a much greater overhaul of what we see as being the role of government.
Fair enough. So, speaking of the role of government, we're in the midst of a transition right now to the Trump administration. Do you have any insights at this point as to how, if at all, President-elect Trump and the new Congress will address retirement security?
Well, like I said, it's not looking particularly good. Trump's labor secretary pick has come out against the minimum wage, raises to the minimum wage. That does not seem like it will give us the opportunity to help people build their income enough that they can contribute to that pot that becomes available to them at retirement. I think if we're looking for a silver lining at this point in the short term, that's probably going to come from the states. So a lot of states have enacted essentially shadow 401k-like plans. They don't necessarily involve annuity purchases, but they're otherwise quite similar. These are often called secure choice. And they're good in that they provide another way for workers to save, and it gives another avenue for people to begin planning for this part of their lives. But a lot of the programs are new, some of them aren't, so we don't really know how well they're going to work. They're also at the state level, so in some ways that creates a patchwork effect, like with all state-mandated programs, that may end up helping the stronger workers or workers in stronger state economies and disadvantaging the people who actually need something like this the most.
Now, I promise I won't take this as professional investment advice, but what, generally speaking, is the percentage of wages or salary people should put towards their retirement?
There are a lot of different methods that people use to calculate this, but one benchmark is that if you want $1,000 a month, for say 30 years, you need roughly $250,000. Another is that you need between 10 and 20, and that's a huge range, I know, but between 10 and 20 times your final annual pay. A different way of looking at it is that you need about 30 times what you expect to spend in your first year of retirement minus what you can expect to get in Social Security. So there are lots of different ways to calculate it. All of them come with fairly big numbers.
Sure, it sounds very daunting. So on to possibly more optimistic topics. In terms of your research, what are you working on now?
So my broader research right now is about employment regulation in the sharing economy, Uber, Lyft, TaskRabbit, and this is actually the way that I got into portable benefits and retirement security, because one of the things that people who are discussing the sharing economy are talking about right now is what happens when all of these people who are driving for Uber or doing copy editing for TaskRabbit when they retire and they haven't saved anything and they've been doing these small gigs, for a space of many years. Some of these platform companies have started to offer affiliated 401k programs, but it's a very gray area and I don't think anyone knows a whole lot about that. But in terms of my broader research, I'm looking at how we can understand whether sharing economy employment is really different. Are the problems that it's presenting different? Some of them are very familiar. And I did a little ethnographic fieldwork this summer where I interviewed Uber drivers, I spoke to policy analysts and workers advocates, and I actually went through the training and application process for a couple of platforms and did a little bit of work, as an Instacart shopper and as a gig walker, which was really interesting.
So do you have any sneak previews in terms of any findings from an ethnographic or other perspective?
Yeah, so one of the things that this sort of qualitative research let me do was see how a lot of the issues that are cropping up because of the sharing economy are really not that different from issues that have been arising in general independent contracting or even domestic household work. They're problems that we've been encountering for a long time, and they stem from, I think, the fact that we misrecognize when work exactly happens. We think that having to drive someone from point A to point B, make small chit-chat during the course of it, provide service, all of that is just something that you might do as a gig instead of watching Law & Order on your sofa, which is really what one of my interlocutors told me. But it's work, and in that sense, sharing economy labor is invisible in the same way that a lot of other forms of labor have been before, and that's just partly the result of the way our employment regulation infrastructure works.
Great. Well, that sounds like the topic for a future episode of Case in Point. But really appreciate you, Deepa, sharing your insights from your Shadow 401ks research, and hope you will join us again about the gig economy.
Thank you so much for
research
having
as well.
me.
And thanks very much, and we hope you join us for the next episode of Case in Point.